Okay, so in our previous video, we talked about why Napoleon was considered a romantic hero, his concern for the underprivileged. He really helped the poor, the lower class, the peasants that were suffering in France. Um, when you look at this image of Napoleon, you can kind of get a sense of the love that people had for him. When you look at this image, take a minute, write down a few things that you see here that makes him seem like a guy that you would trust to lead you. Some of the things I can come up with is this gesture, right? He's pointing ahead, which shows he's a good leader. He's got this huge billowing gold cloak. This gold color is something we see a lot in religious icons. It is this color that is associated with something special. It's rare, it's precious. Look at the way he's handling his horse. He's in control here. He doesn't seem to be putting much effort into um, overpowering or making this horse do what he wants him to do. When you look down here, this is Bonaparte, so that's Napoleon's last name, but you can see Hannibal here and some other names. These are all other leaders that Napoleon has conquered. And then you can see the troops dragging the cannon through this mountain pass in the background. This painting is actually by Jacques-Louis David. We talked about Jacques-Louis David when we talked about the neoclassical movement. We said that he even worked for the Jacobins. But after the Reign of Terror, when Napoleon took control, Jacques-Louis David actually goes to work for Napoleon. And so he used his art to send a message during the revolution to inspire people to behave patriotically and do their civic duty. He does the same thing with Napoleon after the revolution. To support Napoleon, to help people feel okay that Napoleon was their leader, he painted images like this that send that message. This is a strong, confident leader. He has already defeated all these others. He can lead us to victory. This is another image of Napoleon. So this one is by a different artist, and here we're going to start to see the transition from the neoclassical period to those things that we're going to focus on, the characteristics of Romanticism. Napoleon is here in the center. You can kind of see his uniform is kind of similar to what we saw in the painting before. And this is right away, I think the thing that stands out most to me are all of these arches. These are horseshoe arches here, but it's kind of similar to Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii, where we saw the arches in the background. And that's where we can associate this with the neoclassical period. Napoleon enjoyed neoclassical art. He liked the idea that it was associating him with ancient Rome. He wanted to build his empire to be like that of ancient Rome. So he kind of saw himself as a modern day Roman emperor. This is why, for example, he built the Arch of Triumph in Paris, modeled after the triumphal arches that the Romans built in ancient times. So he would have liked this style. In this painting, we are also seeing an artist send messages to people through their work. So this guy, Antoine Jean Gros, very French, right? He is depicting this outbreak of plague. The bubonic plague broke out, and it was affecting both the Muslim troops and the French troops. So Napoleon had invaded, and he was trying to conquer this area, and both his troops and the people he was trying to conquer were being affected by this disease. It was spreading, and people were getting more and more anxious. It was causing panic and hysteria. And so he says, okay, I'm going to go there. I'm going to visit the sick, and that way I can try to calm people down. This is a mosque, which is a church, an Islamic church, that was converted into a hospital. So this is where the sick people were being cared for. And Napoleon is here. He's touching this sick person with his bare hand. And this is showing that Napoleon doesn't have to be afraid of catching this disease. In fact, it almost seems like he has this power with his touch. He can heal people. If you look at his commanders behind him, this guy has a cloth over his face that's going to show us how bad it smells here. These bodies are unwashed. They have this disease. They're suffering. But none of this seems to be affecting Napoleon here in the center. The idea that he is touching here, he might have this power to heal, it's relating Napoleon to Christ and giving him this sort of godlike quality. We see something kind of similar in the lighting. So our artist Gros has this light that seems to be descending right here onto Napoleon while all these other areas are in shadow. And we saw something very similar when we looked at Rembrandt's 100 Guilder print, where you could see Christ here and the light is almost emanating from Christ himself. This one we have Michelangelo's, and we have the suffering that's happening in the last judgment scene that's in the Sistine Chapel, and we can see a very similar figure in the foreground of Gros' painting here. See how they're almost in the same position? So it's kind of saying, hey, these people are in hell, they're suffering. And then I'm just showing you the Oath of the Horatii, so you can compare those arches where you can kind of see that we had that reference to neoclassical. However, when we look at Jacques-Louis David's painting, it's crisp, it's clear, everything is so precise. And if we go back and we look at Gros' painting, it starts to be much more loose. The brushstrokes are looser. Things, you can't really tell 100% what's going on. It's kind of chaotic. We have this architecture in the background that kind of shows us we're in a faraway place. So this is where we see that transition. We're moving away from the neoclassical style, and we're showing this interest in the characteristics of Romanticism. One of our characteristics that we're going to focus on of Romanticism is something called exoticism. Exoticism is the interest in faraway places, specifically North Africa and the Middle East. This is in North Africa, Jaffa, and so you can start to see this influence of this romantic characteristic. Okay, so we're going to move on. These are the list of the romantic characteristics that I want you to know. And I'm going to show you examples of each of these characteristics in different works of art. Because this was a time period where all of these characteristics were popular, the characteristics will overlap. So what I mean is you might see a painting and you might say, oh, she's showing me this as an example of social protest, but I can see some demonic and grotesque in it as well. You're correct. These characteristics, there's not just one in each of the paintings, sometimes there's several. So our main characteristic that we're going to see in the Romantic period is this emphasis on feelings and emotions. The way we're going to see emphasis on feelings and emotion manifest in the arts is through these other things: longing for the past, exoticism, social protest, demonic and grotesque, and emphasis on nature. When we talk about longing for the past, the Romantics are specifically thinking about the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, this is the time before industrialization. So the Romantics go back and they look at the Middle Ages not as they actually were. When we studied the Middle Ages, we talked about the 100 Years' War, we talked about the plague, we talked about people being very confused about the actions of the church. So this doesn't necessarily make sense to us. Why would the Romantics go back and look at this time and say, hey, this is the time when things were better? The big difference is that in the Middle Ages, this is before the Industrial Revolution, we had crafts people and they worked in small shops. There was a family trade. If you were a baker, your son would be a baker. You took pride in what you did. So the Romantics are going to go back to this period and they're going to say, yeah, there was a purity to that. There was a beauty to that. This is also the time of chivalry. So we have a lot of stories written, actually, like the Grimm's fairy tales are written during the Romantic period, where we have knights on white horses saving damsels in distress. Because the Romantics are going to look at the world and they're going to say, people stopped acting chivalrously. People stopped having concern for others. And let's go back and imagine this time when that was not the case. Exoticism, we touched on briefly. I'll show you some more examples. Interest in faraway places. Social protest. This is the Romantics really start to get things in the art world changing. They're going to start breaking the rules. They're going to start using art to make a statement and try to change the world and try to inspire social change, inspire other people to want to change the world. Demonic and grotesque means an interest in the dark side of life. This is where we're going to see images of death, the occult, ghosts, the macabre, anything that has to do with blood, gore. That's the demonic and the grotesque. And lastly, we're going to see an emphasis on nature. We see this with the Transcendentalist movement. I'll tell you more about that. And people are going to look at the landscape as it's disappearing, turning into factories. And they're going to long for the past, long for when they were able to look out and see these beautiful rolling hills. And they're also going to kind of offer a warning, right? That nature is really powerful. And so we need to be careful about how much we are damaging her. Okay, exoticism. This is a painting by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. It's also a very tough French name for you. And this one is called the Grand Odalisque. In this painting, we can see characteristics of exoticism. Ingres was actually one of David's students, but he felt that he wanted to break with his teacher and make what he thought was a purer Greek style. So what he's going to do is he's going to go back and look at Greek vase painting, and he wants to model his figures after figures he would have seen on a Greek vase. If you notice how close she is to the front edge of the canvas, it almost flattens her, and so you kind of get that same quality of what we would call the low relief sculpture that you would see on a Greek vase. So when you look at her, we got to try to think what here gives us an example of something that seems like it's from a faraway place. Now remember, European eyes are looking at this, so you got to think about what's far away to European eyes, or looks like it's something from a faraway place. We have this gorgeous silk drapery here, or fabric. So that kind of looks like maybe it's from someplace far away. You have a fur that she's laying on. Again, that's kind of exotic. Look at these jewels here. She has this headscarf. This is not a style that you wouldn't have seen very often in Europe, so that looks like it's from a faraway place. Her fan has peacock feathers. Peacocks would have been something exotic. Over here you have a hookah, and there's just like the steam coming out of it. So all of these things are referencing back to a faraway place. Now, this is a really problematic thing. Remember how I told you that the Romantics were going back to the Middle East or not the Middle East, sorry, the Middle Ages, and reimagining this time period, putting the rose-colored glasses on. They weren't seeing the Middle Ages how they actually were. Well, they aren't seeing the Middle East and North Africa as it actually was. They're going to pull out some objects from that culture, and they're going to interpret them in a completely different way in order to create a fantasy for European audiences. So if you think about the people you would find in North Africa and the Middle East, this woman does not share the same ideal of beauty that you would think of finding in someone from North Africa or Middle East. She is the European standard of beauty. She's pale, she's white, she's soft. Look at her back. It looks like she has way too many vertebrae. She's elongated. She looks kind of rubbery and soft. And the reason for that is because this nude figure is named an odalisque. This word odalisque is actually from the Turkish word. This is a servant who would attend to women in a harem. You're going to have a homework assignment where I'll ask you to read a first-hand account of what a harem actually is. But when the French heard about this term harem, they took it and they misinterpreted it. They created a false understanding of what it was. They heard that there was a part of the house where women in Islamic households would stay all together, sometimes sisters, wives, cousins, aunts, female children. And they misinterpreted that into being a place where a bunch of women hung out nude, and one man had sexual access to all of these women. This was false, it wasn't true. But you could see in this image that that idea was a really fantasy for Europeans. So they take this idea of this exotic place where women just lay around naked all day, and they add in these elements of a place far away so they can imagine, oh, wow, what would it be like to have that life? And then they put the aesthetics, the beauty standards of a European woman on there. Ingres had a lot of influence from other works of art. Here is a painting by Raphael. It's one of his Madonnas. Look at how similar the face is here. The hairstyle is similar. The headscarf is very similar to the Raphael image here. So he's taking this ideal of beauty, a Western ideal, a European ideal, and putting it in a setting that he thinks is exotic. This is another example by the same artist, Ingres. And this is that idea that Europeans had, that these women in a harem, they sat around naked, they put oils on, some played music, there's a bath, they had servants attending to them, and that there are some aspects here that the architecture, the head wrap, that seem exotic, they seem like they're from a faraway place. This was not true, it's not based in reality, it's not what a harem actually is, but it did become this way for Europeans to fantasize about the culture. It actually is going to lead to some major misinterpretations of a whole bunch of people. So when we think about North Africa and the Middle East, there's lots of different cultures there. They're not just one culture. And they're going to kind of get clumped together in this false fantasy. Westerners are going to take this idea that Westerners are more moral because they are monogamous, and make all these judgments about these cultures, really because of paintings like this. So you'll read more about that in your homework assignment, and there'll be some questions that will address that issue. Hopefully it'll give you a better understanding of what a harem actually is and how the misunderstanding became part of the Western interpretation of these North African and Middle Eastern cultures. This is another image that is an example of exoticism. This one is called The Death of Sardanapalus. It's by another French artist called Eugène Delacroix. Once again, we're seeing a harem here. There's lots of elements in here that seem exotic. Again, take a look at it, make a list, pick out some things that look like maybe they're from a faraway place. And I'll show you some of the things that I found. When you look at this painted furniture here, it's got inlaid wood, it's this intricate design, this is exotic. There's this vase that has this really interesting shape, like a Greek urn, so that's exotic. Our king here is wearing a turban. The jewelry that the women are wearing is exotic. This is not the same style that they would have worn in Europe. You have the elephant heads on our king's bed. His bed has elephant heads on both sides. Elephants are very exotic. The king's guard here and here, they're both wearing turbans. This gentleman, of course, has dark skin. That would have been exotic. The horse is decorated with all these beads and has his mane braided here, as well as there's lots of jewels and lamps and fabrics that look exotic down here in the foreground. This painting is enormous. It is so big. It's really one of those that is remarkable to see in real life. It's very hard to photograph and have all of it come in focus because it is so large. It tells the story. So Eugène Delacroix is not just showing us a fantasy here, he also has a little bit of a social message. This king, Sardanapalus, he was an Assyrian king. Assyria is modern-day Iraq, and this empire, the Assyrian Empire, was an ancient empire. It was not in existence at the time that Delacroix painted this. This king, he heard that invaders were coming. His army reported to him, his guard reported to him, hey, we're not going to be able to fend off this army. And he says, you know what? I am not going to give this invading army the pleasure of taking away all the things I love, of taking us captive. So I want to make sure that when the invaders get here, there's nothing left. So he orders his guard to bring in all the women from his harem. Of course, this is a fantasy. This isn't real, what a real harem is, and kill them. This one was his favorite. She says she wanted to die with him, so that's why she's here right on his bed. You can see the guard back here killing this woman. This guard here is stabbing this woman. The king also says, bring in all of my possessions. That's why all this stuff is piled up down here. Even bring in my horses. If you look, you can see this guard is got his sword into this horse chest right here. Kill the horses too. The idea was that the guards were going to kill everybody and everything, pile all the possessions together, and then set the place on fire. So when the intruders came, they had nothing to take. So this harsh story of our king, Sardanapalus, it's going to leave a message. At this time period, Napoleon has already been defeated, and the French have a new king. How do you think they're going to feel about having a king again? It's not going to take them long to start getting really irritated with having a king who has absolute power. So the message here is kings have always been bad. Kings don't care about the people. That's what Delacroix is trying to say. He uses some really cool artistic techniques. The women's bodies are curved. They almost have this sort of S-like shape. Even the men here are curved. All of these figures here are curved. They almost look like flames, so it's kind of foretelling the idea that these will all be set aflame soon. And there's even a peak to the fire up here. The curves that are used in art, they express emotion. This is a really emotional scene. There's rage, there's terror, there's bloodlust. It's full of all these really intense emotions. So we have lots and lots of curved lines. We also have a lot of this color red everywhere because red is this really intense emotional color. It makes us think about passion. And remember, passion isn't just passionate love. Passion can be passionate rage or passionate lust. When you look at Sardanapalus, though, he is shown in angles. Remember the oath of the Horatii? The brothers were in the angles because they were not emotional. The women in the oath of the Horatii were curved because they were emotional. That same idea is applied here. Sardanapalus, look at his face. He's calm, he's cool, he's collected. He doesn't seem to be very emotional about watching as all of these women that would have once given him pleasure are massacred. I'm including a link in the PowerPoint if you want to learn more about this painting. If you don't remember everything I just said, this is a good link. It's going to tell you more about the painting. That's going to sum up exoticism. I'm going to pause and we'll pick up with social protest.